his own family. So this is a child who was encouraged by his father to read and be interested in these things. Who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Sounds like Jeffrey Dahmer and his dad. His dad encouraged him to do taxidermy. I don't think he realized he was killing the animals, but he certainly was encouraging him to do these things. And that in and of itself, wow. I'm a parent. Joshua enjoyed a lot of different things growing up, but he never enjoyed that kind of stuff. And thank God, because I would have sought out help for him. I would have known it was not normal. So when the family began to show intermittent signs of poisoning during the early part of 61, Young's father initially suspected that Young might be inadvertently harming the family by careless use of his chemistry set at home, but Young denied the accusation. The potential for deliberate poisoning was never considered, especially as Young had also been ill on a number of occasions. It remains unclear whether this was by design to avoid detection, thorough scientific interest in his own reaction, or just carelessness of exactly which teacups he had poisoned. When his elder sister Winifred was found by doctors to have been poisoned by belladonna in November of 61, Young's father again suspected him but took no action. Very common, because we don't want to believe the worst of our children, right? We don't want to believe that they're capable of doing these things when the grim reality of it is they are. If certain things align, this is what you get. Unbelievable. So Young's father, again, suspected but took no action, but Molly Young, his stepmother, became the concerted focus of Young's attentions, gradually becoming more ill until finally on April 21st of 62, she was found by her husband writhing in agony in the back garden of their home, with Young looking on in fascination. She was rushed to the hospital where she later died, and then her cause of death was determined as a prolapse of a spinal bone, and she was cremated at Young's suggestion, with no further action taken at the time. It was later discovered she had developed a tolerance to the antimony with which Young was slowly poisoning her, and he switched to thallium the night before her death to speed up the process. There were even reports of further nausea and vomiting attacks at her funeral. Clearly, the death of his stepmother had not dulled Young's scientific curiosity. So he continued to do these things and continued to be encouraged to study chemistry. He was sent to a police psychiatrist where his encyclopedic knowledge of poisons soon became apparent, and he was arrested on the 23rd of May, 62. I haven't read anything about this. I'm simply making an assumption. This information tells me that he probably was one of those students who had a higher IQ. We talked about that, some of the characteristics of many serial killers. They do have a higher IQ. Now, do they have emotional and social maturity? No, not typically. But certainly a young child like this with this advanced knowledge of chemicals, poisons, chemistry, that's fantastic and great if it's used the right way. But if these things are going on around him, it makes me feel like they were in complete and total denial. Complete and total denial. When it was right there in front of their face. I mean, even if his father, if it went through his mind once, say something about it. Even though you don't, easy for me to sit here and say that because it wasn't my kid. But he's only 14 years old at this time. He's still just a young teenager. And we do know that boys' brains develop slower than females, and they typically don't even finish that development until they're, 25 or 26. So he's really still a child. I don't really care what his age is. He's a child. He was committed to Broadmoor Maximum Security Hospital and was the youngest inmate since 1885. He was there for a minimum of 15 years. Incarceration barely dampened his enthusiasm for experimentation, and within weeks, the death of an inmate, John Berridge, by cyanide poisoning had prison authorities baffled. Young claimed to have extracted cyanide from laurel bush leaves, but his confession was not taken seriously, and Berridge's death was recorded as suicide. On other occasions, staff and inmates' drinks were found to have been tampered with, including the introduction of an abrasive sodium compound commonly called sugar soap, used for preparing painted walls, into a tea urn that could have caused mass poisoning, but had it not been discovered. He continued to read widely about poisoning, although he began to keep his obsession increasingly well hidden, when authorities made it clear that appearing less obsessed would speed up his release. So by the late 60s, his doctors seemed oblivious to his fatal fascination and recommended in 70 to be released because he was cured. He celebrated by informing a psychiatric nurse that he intended to kill one person for every year he had been in Broadmoor. And the comment was recorded on his file, but amazingly, never influenced the decision to release him. He was released on February 4th of 1971 at the age of 23. He contacted his sister. She was concerned by his fixation of his crimes. He took delight in visiting the scenes of his crimes, thriving on the reaction of his old neighbors. He made trips to London and stocked up on different poisons. Just continual. He just continually sought out these things. So he ended up, what got him put in for life was he killed some coworkers. He would volunteer to make their tea and coffee for them, and eventually his boss, 59-year-old Bob Eggle, began to experience severe cramps and dizziness, and it was attributed to a virus that was thought to be going around, known locally as the Bovingdon bug, but had afflicted a number of other school children. But Halen workers complained of similar cramps, but none were ever as severe as Eggles, who curiously seemed to recover when off work when he was ill, but instantly became sicker than ever on his return to work. He died in agony on July 7th, and his death was recorded as pneumonia. Again, he had another one in 60-year-old Fred Biggs. Same thing. When he was off work, he got better. When he came back to work, he got much worse. It took him a very long time to die, which was very frustrating to Young, who recorded his displeasure in his diary, but he eventually succumbed on 19th of November 71 in excruciating pain. So that was the last death where that got him arrested. And of course he had the trial and he was found guilty on all charges. He was incarcerated at the maximum security Parkhurst prison on the Isle of Wight, the home of Britain's most serial criminals, usually reserved for those with severe mental conditions. And he befriended a lot of these horrible people while he was in prison. So he really, at no point in time in his life was he ever around other than his family, who he used as, victims or tests, scientific tests or experiments, used him for that. But he never really had regard for life. He was more interested in what, the scientific side of poisoning and what it would do to the human body. And in 95, oddly enough, a black comedy about Young's life entitled The Young Poisoner's Handbook was released in cinemas. I've never heard that. Don't know that I want to watch it. If it's based on his life and it's factual, that's one thing. but if it's based on his life and crimes and it's fictionalized, I mean, I want to know. It's not that I wouldn't watch it. I probably would, but I want to know, is this fictionalized? Did you add to the story to make it more interesting? You know, all those things that we know they do in Hollywood. But he died August of 1990, age of 42. And really, think about all the things he had done before he was, arrested. And what he was able to do, and then died at the age of 42, which is incredibly young. I mean, he did a lifetime of crazy, insane things. And it, wasn't caught until he had already killed 4 people in very horrific ways. So, again, I think that's, parents, guardians, family members not wanting to believe that their person, their child, their spouse, whomever would be able or capable of doing that. And then, the things we do in society, like if they meet this criteria, and this criteria, let me check off this list and you get released from jail. Yeah. Most of these people are smart enough to know how to manipulate the system. And he was. For them to think that, well, I think he's been reformed. He's been cured. Cured was the word they used. They're never going to be cured. They're never going to be cured. There are some medications that you can give to help with, the psychiatric issues. They can help with the, decreasing those episodes. But it has to be monitored. You can't. Who's the one we studied who they released him on his own with his medication, with this idea that he was going to go out into the world and take his medication on his own and be responsible for that after he had been in an institution and cared for 24/7. It's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling. There's just no common sense to that whatsoever. But it happens. It happens, and I think we need to be aware of that. I think we need to be aware that, unfortunately, there are people who are not going to be reformed. Serial killers, not going to be reformed. I do not know of a reformed serial killer. I'm going to look that up because now I'm curious. I do not know of a reformed serial killer. And if they do say that they're reformed, I still don't think that they've been released. It says there's a few. 7 notorious killers who actually went straight. 10 killers who changed their minds. I'll check it out. I'll read that. That'll be another podcast we'll do later. We're still on the children. There's going to be several different parts to this because there's so many of them. But thanks for tuning into this one today. We will continue this discussion in the next podcast, maybe later this week. And I found this really cute. It was a meme on Facebook, and I said I'm going to start using that as my sign off on my podcast. It was stay sexy and don't get murdered. That's not funny, but yet it is. I don't know. I have a sick sense of humor sometimes. Thanks for listening. Again, as always, if you want to ask a question, want to have a discussion, the best way to get me is my email, drkimberlycassidy89@gmail.com. Have a great one.